Hey guys, thanks for tuning into CMTEQ channel. This tutorial is going to be all about soldering, fundamental of soldering. Not everything about soldering, but just the basic steps and tricks that you can do, you can learn, and to improve your soldering skills. So at the end of this tutorial, you should be able to accomplish some of the basics soldering required. So without wasting any further time, let's get going. Now to do soldering, obviously you need a solder, okay, like a roll of solder like this one here, and you obviously also need a soldering iron like this one here. This is just a soldering iron top, you can see. So the solder I'm using is this one here, is a Magnum soldering iron. And this one is particularly good because you can control the temperature in which you are soldering, because you don't want it too cold or too hot, just enough to complete and do a clean soldering. Also noting that the melting point of your solder, like this one here, is at about 200 degrees to 220 degrees, okay, for a lead-free solder. So you have to have a soldering iron that you can control the temperature in which you will be soldering. You also need some soldering equipment to facilitate your soldering. So I'm holding two of the basics one that are mostly used here. This one here is called a solder sucker. Just like the name implies, it does suck solder. So you push it in, you apply it close to the point where you want to desolder, because these ones are used for desoldering. And once the solder melt, okay, at a set temperature, and then you just press it there, and it's going to suck your solder and allowing you to desolder your component. And the other one is this one. This one is also a solder sucker, but it's actually called solder wick. So you use it. This film here is made of copper. So by applying this element here, let me just cut off this one that's already used. Now to demonstrate how a solder sucker and a solder wick work, we're going to desolder this wire link, because these guys are used precisely for desoldering. Now I'm going to just apply some soldering to this point here. So I'm going to apply some soldering. So I will create a solder joint there. Now we've got the connections. Now I want to desolder it. I just found out now, well, this wire link is not where it's supposed to be, or this is a bad component that I need to remove. So I'm going to use now my solder wick to desolder. So I remove that part that's been used already. Now remember, this is a copper film. So by applying it here, it's going to suck all the solder into it. It's supposed to be called solder sucker also, but it's actually called solder wick. As you can see, I suck all the solder into this copper film here. And what happened is there is no more solder left onto the solder joint there. So basically the component here is now loose. As you can see there, it's now loose. Now I want to remove on this side as well, so that we can have the whole component to completely be removed. Now to achieve that, I'm going to use now the solder sucker. Now the way the solder sucker works is exactly the same way, but the solder must melt, okay? The solder must melt, and then you must suck it from this high pressure air release here while it melts. So what I'm going to do, exactly the same process, I'll put my soldering tip there. Just as the solder is very soft, I suck, and you can see there is no more solder left, and you can eject it there, and you can do it multiple times. Now let me put in more solder so we can demonstrate very well how does this thing work here. So I put in more solder and I suck. As you can see, it's sucking all the solder there. You can do it multiple. Look there, I just ejected this one from there. That's what I just sucked now. So I'll just suck again there. Boom. There it is. And you can see that the wire link that I wanted to desolder, have been desoldered and it's very loose. So this is how you use a solder sucker and the solder wick, which are both critical for repairing, doing your electronics repair. Now the next tips or tricks, whatever you call it, I'm going to show you guys here is how to connect two wires, okay, using a solder. Okay, so you basically want to bond the two wires. So the tools that I have in front of me here is basically a helping hand. So it helps you to do some soldering work without having to burn your hands, because if you are joining two hot wires that will get hot as you solder them, then the helping hand will make sense. For instance, if I want to thin this wire that have been stripped already, I'll clamp it onto this helping hand, and then I'm going to apply the solder like this. Then the wire have been thin, and I can equally so do the same onto the other side. So I will also turn the wire. Remember, your soldering tip must always be shining. Okay, so if your soldering tip is not shining, you're going to have some difficulty to achieve soldering properly. So you must always maintain clean. As you can see, I'm always cleaning the tip there. I'm going to apply again soldering so I can thin my wire. Just there, like that. There. Now if I want to join these two wires, I just bring them closer. Okay, I just bring them closer like this, just to create a link like that. So they are now closer. So what I'm going to do is just to apply the soldering to the two of them. Boom. Now the two wires have been joined. So I've got a connection. I've got a connection that will not break. Okay, but now what if you do not have a helping hand like this one? So basically you have your own hands to use. So I'm going to demonstrate with these two wires here if you do not have a helping hand. So the first thing is to strip them. So I'm going to strip the wire. Now there's two methods here. Now the first method here is the easiest one. So you take the two wires you just stripped, and then you just join them without using the solder first. So you just join them together like this. Now they are connected, but they are not strong. So you clamp one end of the wire between your two fingers on your left hand, depending of whether you are left-handed or right-handed. Then you bring your solder closer this way. Then you take your soldering iron and you bring it closer. So what you're going to do, you're just going to apply solder to the two pair. Then boom, you have your solder joint that have been created between the two wires. And this one here is very strong. And you can see that I've achieved this without using the helping hand. Basically, I help myself with my two hands if you cannot afford this guy here. Okay, now once you have a connection like this, you can see that the connection is open. So after that, you have to use a heat shrink to apply around it and close it so that this point here is not exposed and create some short into your circuit. Now another way to connect the two wire is this way here. I'm going to just cut this that we just did now. So we just cut it. I'm going to strip the wire again. We strip the wire. Okay. And then I'm going to apply the solder only to one point. Again, the method using only my hand. I'm not using the helping hand. And then apply the solder onto this point as well. just like that. Okay, then it's too long, I'll just cut it to make it slightly short, and then I'll take the other one as well, and then I cut it. Okay, so now I've got 2 turn points that I need to join together. Now if I've got this helping hand, it will be very easy, just like we did with those 2 wires here. But I do not have a helping hand. But if you have a press sticks, this guy here, a press sticks. So what you're going to do is just put a press sticks there, down, and then you press this one into the press sticks, as you can see. So what you're gonna do then is to bring this one closer, and then you're going to solder the 2 of them. Obviously, in this case, you're going to just put some solder onto your solder tip, and then you bring this one closer like that. Then you apply the solder. Boom. Then you have your solder joint created. So you can see we've achieved 2 solder joints exactly the same. One using the fancy tool, okay, and the other one just using our hands and the methods. Okay, so remember these steps and practice them, you're going to get good at it. Now the next thing, we're going to do some application here of soldering, okay? So what we're going to do is, I'm going to solder this connector here into this board here. You can see these are all being manually soldered. These are being hand soldered, and this ones here have been soldered with the heat gun using the heat paste, okay, the solder paste. But the connectors have been manually soldered. As you can see, they have been soldered so nicely that it's close to perfection. But it takes skills to solder like this. But if you practice, you're going to get good at it, and you can solder just like this. Now to demonstrate how these hand soldered I've done, I'm going to solder this connector here onto this board. Just now we're going to see. Now before we do that, I would like to demonstrate quickly on this Vero board here how to avoid doing a bad dry soldering. So I'm just going to put a press stick to hold the connector there. Okay, so this is the connector that we want to solder onto this Vero board. So I put my connector there. Now because I just want to hold it while I do my solder, so I'm going to put a press sticks underneath there, because I don't want to solder it skew. It must be sitting very well before I solder it. Okay, so you want it to be sitting flat. So I put a press sticks. Now I know it can't fall anymore, but I need to put some solder onto those points here at the back, so that if I remove my press sticks, it doesn't fall. Obviously that's what we want to do. That's why it's called solder. Okay, so now I'll put my Vero board down. I grab my solder, and then I take my soldering iron. Now I want to achieve some good soldering joint. So I bring my solder closer to the metal, and then as soon as it melts, I remove my soldering iron tip, and I move to the next one. Same method, same process. Now you can see how the thing is reflowing and it's soldering so nice. Now what you have to avoid here is, because remember, as I've told you, when you do like this, you can see there is some smoke rising. If you can see the smoke. Now this smoke is as a result of the flux that is inside this lead-free solder. And that is to eliminate the oxidation on the metal here, because it's been lying around. There's obviously some oxidation that I've created. Now that flux is going to allow to eliminate, remove it, and create a good solder bond. But you can also solder without the flux, but you have to be very good at it. Now, to avoid messing up the situation is, you must not let your solder stay too long, because what will happen is the heat will dry the flux. So the heat of your soldering iron will dry the flux. Now if you keep your soldering on for very long, what it does is it will suck all the flux out. As you can see, the smoke rising. So what happened is this solder here on this top here is it's melted, it's in the melting point, but there is no more flux in it. Therefore, if I try to apply it there, it doesn't stick very well. Now, to achieve good soldering, there is only one secret. That is, don't keep the soldering iron too long. Because if you keep the soldering iron too long, you're going to suck all the flux out, and then you won't be able to eliminate oxidations. So then you're going to have soldering that does not stick. As you can see, like this one here, you can see it's now going to create dry soldering, and the joint is going to be weak, and over a long time period, you're going to have some cracks, and your electronics product is not going to work anymore. So you must always be quick. You apply, you remove, you apply, you remove. Now to demonstrate that perfectly, I'm going to, let me take my press sticks. You can see this connector that we solder here is nicely soldered. Now let me take my press sticks, and I'm going to solder this connector here onto this board. Okay. Once again, I will apply some press sticks here just to hold it in place. So I turn my board. Now you can see here, this is where I need to apply soldering into this point here. I take my soldering iron once again, and then I will apply, and I remove fast. Then I'm going to do this side as well, and then I remove. So I'm not keeping my soldering iron longer, because if I do that, it's going to dry the flux and I won't be able to achieve good soldering. Now here, because my component is not sitting very flat, so I just hold it and then and then melt the solder and then push it, and then I'll do exactly the same thing at this point here. That way I can have my component sitting nicely flat, because you don't want to solder a component skewed and then you don't like it. Okay, so after doing that, I know that my component is now sitting very flat on the board. So what I'm going to do now is to solder the whole thing. So I'm going to quickly achieve all my soldering joint here. There we go. There we go. There we go. And this one. And this one. And this one. I can even add more solder here and also add more solder there. Now you can see that we've achieved a good hand soldering, exactly as this one. So this is how you achieve good soldering. So the tricks here, is simple. When you are soldering, don't keep your solder for too long, and make sure you have a soldering iron that you can control the temperature. Remember that your solder melting point is at around 220 degrees there. Some of them are even 180 if it's a leaded solder, but lead free require a higher temperature melting point. So make sure you don't put it too hot, not too cold, and as soon as you apply it to the point where you want to solder, you put some solder, and then it's melt, you take it off, and it's going to reflow itself. That's why it's called reflow soldering. So you do that quick enough, you're going to achieve good soldering, just as this board here. And this is the same process, and the same process I use to solder some of these modules here. Like you can see, this is an Arduino Nano board, and these have been developed in China. Some factories there, they got people who do hand soldering and some pick and place. So like the small Atmega 328 we have here, I've been soldered using the heat paste, the solder paste, and then it went into a reflow soldering and it was achieved. But if you have the tools, you can also do this manually. If you have the tool to remove and replace another one, you can also do this manually, doing exactly the same process that I've explained you now, by applying quick enough and removing. Don't keep it for too long, so that you can just achieve a good soldering melt point and a reflow happening without eating away your flux that will make removing oxidations a difficult process. And this is how, like right now, you can see I'm just repairing this soldering or making it better to make sure I restore this chip and don't create dry joint over time. So that's exactly how all these things are done. I hope you've learned something in this tutorial. Please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to CMTEQ channel. That will be highly appreciated. Until next time, stay tuned for next tutorial where we're going to be doing a lot of soldering of our DIY project. Thank you. Until next time, cheers.